Crikey, so I haven't done a craft challenge in months and months and months, so with great purpose I attempted to make some air dry clay hearts to use as wedding favours. So as usual, well not as usual because I haven't done a craft challenge in absolutely ages, but I'll be sharing all of my failures and all my successes so that if you want to have a go at making these, you can learn from my mistakes and not make the same mistakes as me. So full disclosure, I went through about 4 kilograms of clay during this process to discover the best way to make these. Because after all, I wasn't making these for myself, I was giving them away as wedding favours for my daughter's wedding in October. If you want to have a go at making these yourselves, I will put all the equipment that you need to make these successfully in the video description, along with the timestamps if you need to come back and reference where you're at making your own. So starting out, I was armed with 1 kilogram of air dry clay in white and a heart-shaped cutter. Now I did watch a few clay tutorials, although nothing specific to the heart-shaped magnets that I wanted to make. Now I do have a limited experience with air dry clay, and most of my attempts have been fairly rustic, to say the least. However, I did have enough knowledge to know that cling film and baking paper were going to become my best friends in this process. So I made some stays to ensure that I could roll out the clay to the right thickness, and I just used a wodge of scrap paper to the height of about 7mm, and I spaced these apart so that the rolling pin would sit nicely on top of them, and that way when I rolled out the rolling pin, my clay would not go lower than the thickness of the paper either side. So this rolling pin is reserved just for clay and art projects, and I recommend that you have one that's the same. And I do recommend that you don't use your kitchen rolling pin, do buy one that's just for this process. So my intention was to use some of these flowers, or weeds rather, to make some impressions in the clay hearts. So I laid down some cling film on the surface and I sliced off a good portion of clay. I didn't need it. I do think that you're supposed to need it, but my upper body strength is absolutely rubbish, so I skipped that step. In fact, it was hard enough for me to even roll out the clay. Initially, I covered my rolling pin in cling film, but I soon took that off when I realised it was kind of making crinkle marks in the clay. So what I did instead was I lay a sheet of flat cling film on top of the clay, so the clay was sandwiched then between 2 sheets of cling film, just to stop the rolling pin from sticking to the clay and from the clay sticking to the surface I was rolling it out on. So I've already mentioned I watched a few air dry clay tutorials, and the lovely lady at Red Rocking Bird, I'll put the link in the description, had said that if you flip the clay with each roll, it would help prevent it sticking. So I did make this a best practice between each of the rolls that I did. So I was going to use some of this foliage, or weeds rather, to make some impressions in the clay hearts. So once I'd rolled out the clay flat, I then laid the weeds around the edge of the clay. Then I replaced the cling film and I rolled it all over so that the weeds were impressed into the clay. Simple enough process until the weeds stuck in the clay. I did discover in batch 3 of these that it was better to leave these in and just pick them out when they were dry, simply because as I was trying to get the weeds out of the clay whilst it was still wet, I'd get fingernail marks in the damp clay and I was making a bit of a mess of it. Now I do have long fingernails, but you know, if you've got shorter fingernails, it'd be even harder to get the weeds out of the clay, wouldn't it? So the best way to cut out the heart shapes is with the cling film still on top of the clay. Now what this does is it kind of gives a rounded edge to the top of the clay as you're cutting, And it also stops the clay from sticking to the cutter, which is really helpful, because if you try cutting them out without using the cling film on top, you'll know exactly what I mean. And then once all your heart shapes have been impressed, pull back the cling film. Pull off the edge pieces that you don't need, because it's easier to pull off the edge pieces than to try and lift the hearts out at this stage. Then once you've got the edge pieces out the way, you can lift up the cling film that's on the bottom and gently peel it away so that you can remove the heart from the cling film without misshaping it. Put it to one side to dry on a sheet of baking paper. I managed to get about 32 hearts from 1 kilogram of clay, so I basically just kept rolling out the clay until I had all of my hearts cut, and then I laid them all out on a sheet of baking paper and put them to one side to dry. Now, it's really, really important that you turn your hearts regularly, because if you don't, they'll start curling up at the edges. So what I did was I went and turned my hearts, every single one of them, every 3 hours throughout the day. Overnight, I would put a sheet of baking paper on the top of all of the hearts as well and cover it with a board. In the morning, I would wake up, I'd pull the board off, pull the baking paper off and leave them for 3 hours, and then go back and flip them over again. It took about 4 days for these hearts to dry completely, and I didn't experience any curling up on the edges on the second batch I did on the first batch. So I discovered this method of flipping them every 3 hours was the best practice on the second batch that I did. On the first batch that I did have some of them curling up at the edges. So once they're dry, you need to do some sanding, and I found using 2 different grades of sandpaper was best. I used a rougher sandpaper on the edges and then a fine sandpaper on the top and the sides, just to smooth out all of the creases. In some places I had fingernail marks, so I had to use a really fine sandpaper, and it took quite a lot of effort. In fact, it took me over an hour to sand down 32 hearts. I also did this outside, so I didn't really film the whole process of that, but it is really, really worth doing. Any imperfections will really show up on your final hearts, so it's really important that you really do just get the best finish possible. I'll put the different grades of sandpaper that I was using in the video description in the equipment list. So once they were all sanded, I was faced with the prospect of sealing them and painting them. Now, I had heard from the Red Rocking Bird website that Mod Podge works or varnish will work. So to start with, in the first batch, I used Mod Podge. Now, this took quite a long time to dry. It was very tacky the following day, and that was when I realised it was going to take 4 weeks for it to cure properly. If you've ever used Mod Podge before, yeah, it does take a long time to properly cure, and the wedding was just 4 weeks away at this point, so I didn't have 4 weeks to wait for it to cure. So in the second batch, I used an acrylic varnish over the raw clay, over the raw dry clay, and that dried within a few hours. Now I needed to figure out how to paint these hearts. So I figured out the best thing I could do was to put some acrylic paint down to make them properly white, because they were very much an off-white at this stage. I didn't get a very good finish, to be quite honest with you. I wasn't very happy. I was getting a lot of brush marks, and it looks nasty, doesn't it? It wasn't good. I also tried applying the paint with a brush into the recesses of the weeds and wiping it off, and it was too messy. I was getting streaks of blue all over the rest of the heart. It was soaking into the varnish, it was soaking into the acrylic paint, and yeah, it was so messy, and I was so disappointed that I was like, well, what can I do? What can I do? I'm not getting a lovely, nice finish on these. These are never going to do as wedding favours if they look like this. So I had an epiphany as I was falling off to sleep one night that I should try using enamel. So on batch 3 of these wedding favours, I rolled them, I cut them, I dried them, took 4 days, I sanded them, that took another day, I varnished them, that took a little bit of time as well, and then I applied enamel. Now this is just the model making enamel paint that you can buy, and it's just white gloss, and all I did was I applied it around the edge of the hearts. And then I applied it over the top. I wasn't letting it go down into the recesses. Now when you're applying this enamel, you want to get it on very thick. You want it on thick because it is self-leveling, and any minor imperfections or brush marks will just disappear in the drying process. Now they do take quite a long time to dry, and it is quite a messy process. So if you don't like getting paint on your hands, do wear some craft gloves or something. It doesn't bother me, so I just went ahead and got messy fingers. I ended up at the end of this process with enamel all over my hands and in my hair. In fact, it's probably still in my hair because it won't come out of my hair. Anyway, once the enamel was dry, and that did take a day or two, so I think it was pretty much dry the following morning, but I left it another 6 hours or so before I went back to paint. Now what I did was I hand painted in the recesses with a very fine detail brush. I used some acrylic paint initially, and when that was dry I used the De La Rowney FW pearlescent ink in waterfall green. And yeah, I was very pleased with these. The only issue was I didn't have a fine enough paintbrush to put the gold ink down the stems. So what I found was if I used a cocktail stick, just dipped in the ink and dabbed it along the recesses, it would just flow itself in. Now you can't pick up a lot of ink with the cocktail stick, but it works. It worked really well. So on occasion I had a few slightly not good ones and bits where I hadn't put down the enamel properly and I just gave it another coat. And there were also areas where the acrylic paint had stained the enamel when I'd overshot it, so I just touched those up with a fine brush of enamel as well. And yeah, absolutely fabulous. The only thing I had to do next was, I didn't seal the backs, by the way. I varnished the backs, but I didn't actually put any paint or anything on the backs. And I just attached a really strong craft magnet. Now, if you go into a lot of your craft shop, you'll find that they sell craft magnets. They are absolutely rubbish. You want to get some extra strong ones. I picked mine up off eBay and they are super strong and they will hold lots of things on the fridge.